Hello and welcome to today's unveiling of BEV 50 presented by Alpha Diver in partnership with Beverage Digest. My name is Dwayne Stanford, editor and publisher of Beverage Digest, which serves the industry's top executives with a carefully curated subscription newsletter, go-to reference books illuminating brand-level sales data and soft drink franchise territories, as well as an annual Future Smarts conference, where we bring together industry thought leaders to determine what's next in beverages. We invite you to visit us at beverage-digest.com to get a feel for our content and, most importantly, to join in. I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion with Alpha Diver founder and president Hunter Thurman. Hunter's vision for Alpha Diver was to apply behavioral science to more deeply understand marketplace behavior. He gathered leading minds in the worlds of neuroscience and psychology and quickly discovered the wealth of insight that was sitting untapped within academia. He and his team built the framework of durable, predictable human truths, specifically the 4 drivers and 5 barriers that underlie behavior. Hunter's team works with the world's leading brands and the Wall Street analyst community to continually explain, measure, and predict consumer behavior. Today's presentation of the BEV 50 grew out of a shared desire by Hunter and me to apply new learning from the world of neuroscience to the largest and most category-defining brands in the world. We see the BEV 50 as a conversation starter to bring you inside this method of measuring how consumers view brands and make purchase decisions. So here's the format for today. Hunter will present his team's findings, and then he'll join me for a follow-up Q&A. Please use the Q&A tab found in the Zoom interface, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can in our hour together. The slides and recording of today's presentation will be available to registrants later. So with that, I'd like to welcome Hunter Thurman to unveil the BEV 50. Hunter, hello.
Hey, Dwayne. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this discussion. I will set up my sharing here without further ado and launch into this. So as you said, I mean, the vision here is that we are, every brand, every retailer, every manufacturer is trying to figure out how to grow, how to put the right message in front of the right person at the right time in ways that will drive behavior, which of course is sounds simple, but is easier said than done. And the reason that insights and strategy and marketing activation can be so challenging is because if you look at human behavior from a psychological level, we humans don't really understand why we do what we do. You hear so much about how much of our behavior and decision making happens subconsciously. And that's true. So much goes on behind the scenes mentally in terms of what categories we choose, when and what we choose to drink, what brands we choose. And so in order to diagnose that more deeply, to understand that more fully, and as you set up using knowledge from neuroscience and psychology, this study and this report that I'll share here is the industry's first measure of the psychological drivers of real world consumer behavior. So it's the things that happen in consumers' heart of hearts, if you will, often unbeknownst to them, but that drive their behavior. So, we're talking about the whys of brand performance. And of course, the list format, I'll comment on some of the things that we see looking at these top 50 brands. And that's useful. It's useful to kind of say, well, where are our brands stacking up and portfolios stacking up now? What's more useful, obviously, is so what and now what? What do we do about that? So we're looking at, so I'll talk about things like consumer affinity, usage momentum, trajectories, some leading indicators of where brands and portfolios are headed, and then some brand growth paths. And I'll talk about this psych pulse that we use and that we've applied here in this endeavor together. So what we're going to cover is brands covering over generating over 70 billion of annual sales, obviously massive category, beverage category, across 8 categories, those that you cover with Beverage Digest. I'm gonna provide some view of this measure, the actual study itself, but it's based on over 100 different psychological metrics with a US rep pop sample. So you see some of the basic demographics here. We fielded this in April and then again just recently and replicated it with about 3,000 respondents. Very carefully quality controlled in terms of our participant respondents, and reflective of the US Gen Pop. So you can see some of the breakouts there. This is a sort of a schematic. A lot of people ask, well, what is this psych pulse? What is this instrument? What is neuroscience? And so, essentially what we're doing is using neuroscience and psychology, and our team, as Dwayne mentioned, has created this this instrument that lets us assess not just some of the demographics I just showed, but we're covering things like what's someone's experience with a brand. We're attributing what their psychology is, what their perceptions are relative to the brand. So you see on the lower left here, choose the word cloud that fits best, and we'll show Pepsi, Zero Sugar, or Gatorade, or whatever brand, and they click this word cloud. It's this method that the team has created that leverages neuroscience to let us understand their psychology, their perceptions that they don't even recognize. There's things about openness, enthusiasm, how often they consume, and you see that these questions that the concepts here are not. It's not something you can't get your brain around. But there are these kind of fuzzed out response boxes. Of course, when we engage with our partners, we're happy to share those, but we've kept them just a little bit obscured here. Those are the responses that a respondent sees, are where there's this unlock in understanding their awareness and the drivers and barriers, their openness to the category, the degree to which it's routinized, and I'll talk more about that. The usage momentum is the trajectory up, flat, or down. And then what we call psychological importance. How entrained, as the scientists call it, are they? In lay terms, how hard would it be to give up? And those are the types of things that when you're a brand practitioner, you can really start to diagnose, is my brand or parts of my portfolio vulnerable? Are there parts that are really strong? What are the headwinds and tailwinds that we're facing? And what can we do about that? So to step back and synthesize, and as Dwayne said, please feel free to capture any questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time to circle back on Q&A. But essentially, what we've done is rank these via this composite score of all those factors that I just covered. And as we go through this, I'm going to continue to hit these three circles on the Venn diagram. What's really, what we found in our database, which goes back to about 2018, and in our ongoing data, what we found to be the most important in understanding brand performance and the implications are how routinized is it, meaning like how much of a part of their life is it? Is it routine, or is it something that kind of comes and goes? With that, how attached are they? How hard would it be to give up, as I mentioned? And then lastly, the trajectory. What's the usage momentum? You look at those three together and you see that check mark. That's the metric. That's the data by which we prioritize these. So it not only rates and ranks, which is interesting for the purpose of this list, but as I said, it explains the whys behind it, and challenges ahead. And you see a picture of our principal neuroscientist, Siggy Hale, who is the architect of all of this and leads our data team that creates these measures. Okay, so now the list. And one caveat, I'm not trying to build suspense or a cliffhanger here, but remember, this is the top 50. These brands are all strong performers, and they're based on the way we got to these 50 that we've measured is, obviously volume. You're going to see the big dogs in here, a lot of big formidable brands, and then you're going to see some that have been making a lot of waves or noise or have created a lot of intrigue, smaller startups. So you're going to see a wide range of it. And remember, this is not the top 50 based on volume or sales velocities or IRI or some of the more traditional measures that we use. These are the top 50 ranked and rated based on those psychological factors. So it's a very different set of criteria. And with that, from 1 to 50, none of these are like laggards. I mean, this is like, the cream of the crop in terms of performances. So just bear that in mind as we go through these. I'm going to show you the brands, and remember, each of them will have this little icon you'll see next to it. So remember, there's the trajectory. Is it, are people going to be consuming more, same, less? How routinized is it? And that's a percentile. So it'll be relative to, they'll all be relative to each other in terms of the routinization, as is attachment. So how strongly attached. So the little glass is, how routinized is it? And the heart is how psychologically attached are they to that? Remember also that this is Gen Pop. So this list, this ranking, and I'm going to show some breakouts as we go at a demographic level. But the difference between Gen Pop and Gen Z, for example, or men or women or different demographics can be quite different. This is all at the macro US Gen Pop rep level. Okay, so we have these in groups of 10. You see that the number one performer here is Gatorade, followed by Starbucks Frappuccino, Lipton bottled tea, and so on. You see Nestle Pure Life, interestingly, a water brand, Coke, some bottled coffee with Dunkin', Red Bull, Powerade, Aquafina, and Vitamin Water. And just to reorient a bit, look at Gatorade. It's got 94th percentile in terms of routinization, meaning it's highly routinized. Those that are using Gatorade, it's a part of their life. It is something that they do. Look at Coke number 5, same way. It's highly routinized. So of users that use it, it's a part of their life. Gatorade would be, in this case, and this is not why it's number 1, but you remember it's a composite score. In this case, it would be the hardest to give up. So again, for those using it, it's highly routinized, would be very difficult for them to give up. It's very entrenched. Its usage momentum you see is that kind of flat, meaning it's stable. What we find, and we can talk more about, is the bigger the brand, the harder it is to grow. So oftentimes you'll see that some of the smaller startup brands have positive usage momentum. They're growing more quickly, which makes sense. A brand like Gatorade, Coke, those are harder to grow. They've got higher penetration. We typically see they're more likely to have steady momentum. And so you see that in this case, Gatorade is flat. Look down at Coke. There, as I said, it's highly routinized. People drinking Coca-Cola it's a part of their life. It wouldn't be as hard for them to give up. And there's some diagnostics we can get into, but it's 51st percentile, kind of middle of the pack in terms of like how difficult would that be to give up. And with Coke, you see that the usage momentum is declining. That does not mean that Coca-Cola is in trouble. At a Gen Pop level, there's some downward pressure on the trajectory. At the you look at a brand like Coke at some different cohort levels and some different demographic levels, for example, it very well may be increasing. So those are some of the things that as we dig in on a given brand we look for, but that orients you a bit. And there may be some surprises on this page. It's interesting that there's a couple bottled coffee. We see that as we'll talk more about categories, but we see that that's a pretty strong space. And there's a pretty, as I kind of mentioned, pretty diverse set of categories on this page. From CSDs to isotonics to energy to bottled coffee, waters, etc. We can circle back to these as well. You look kind of the second grouping here, 11 to 20. Again, you see, a brand like Pepsi, 84th percentile in terms of routinization, pretty strong, not quite as strong as Coke on attachment. Would be a little bit easier to give up, again, at a Gen Pop level. And so, what we can do with these data is go into a more of a profile view and say, look, who's Pepsi getting? Who aren't they? Who's vulnerable? You can really dig into that. But again, at the aggregate level, these are the results we see. And you see some smaller brands, Essentia, et cetera, Body Armor, which is not a new entrant, but a newer sort of real competitor in the isotonic space. Then you see here's 21 to 30. Of note, in the middle of the list, and what you see, if you kind of look at those arrows, they pop around a little bit more. There's more up, more down, more sideways. This, if you kind of squint at this page, those arrows are more variable. What we find is in kind of the middle of the data set from a usage momentum standpoint, oftentimes that's where there's, the bigger established brands are typically more stable. They're harder to grow, but likewise, they're fairly entrenched. They've got pretty strong penetration and buy rate. At the bottom is where it's like, you know, a lot of strong momentum. Brands that get a toehold, there's a lot of trial, a lot of growth. Then you get into this kind of middle, and you see there's everything from like Sprite to you know, like Electrolyte, like newer and Chameleon, you know, newer entrants or smaller players. This is where there's a little bit of kind of the proving ground. Are they going to continue their momentum and become more entrenched and become bigger brands? Are they going to flatten out or decline and be more of kind of a flash in the pan type brand? We see that in kind of this middle space that there's, especially from the momentum, where are they headed? Are they going to become more routinized? You see that those, you know, Sprite is and Dr. Pepper, again, for their users, they're more routinized. But generally in this page, you see there's less routinization, a little less, you know, the heart, a little lower heart, a little less psych attachment. So there's a little bit of limbo kind of in this middle space. You see that Dr. Pepper is dead center, number 25. And because it came out in that space, I'm going to use it as an example in a few slides coming up. We get down, and remember, this is I wouldn't even call it the worst of the best, but this is you know, the top tier. So, you know, this is not to disparage or diminish any of these brands, but, you know, you look to 30 to 40, and then rounding out the top 50, you know, notably a brand like Starry, a newer brand. You know, it hasn't taken hold yet. And, you know, there's things on this that say, well, you'd hope that Starry's usage momentum would be, as I mentioned a minute ago, because it is something newer, the trial would be driving a positive usage momentum. Things like that tell us that it hasn't yet taken hold. Another note is if you look at kind of the bottom, like the 30 to 50, 31 to 50, there is a fair amount of like the zero sugar, you know, between diet, which is sort of a less focal subset, but the zero sugar, which is a more focal subset for a lot of manufacturers. Those, what we see in the data, and I'll comment on this a little bit more to come, they don't have a really strong psychological signal. They're not doing, and I'm lumping sort of all the zeros into one sort of characterization here. They're not doing a whole lot. They're not meaning a whole lot. So that's another theme, you know, as we kind of look at the list, that there's opportunity for, I believe, commercial innovation for zero sugar brands to stand out better. So that goes through the 1 to 50. We can circle back, and now sort of some points of interest. You know, we look at, this is just sort of the top 3, bottom 3, again, looking at these aggregate scores. Interesting, still water overall is the strongest performing category, followed by soft drinks, and I mentioned ready to drink coffee. Down and kind of towards the bottom 3, enhanced water, ready to drink tea, sparkling and bubbly water. I know I've said it 20 times, but that does not mean that, you know, all should get out of the sparkling or bubbly space. It's just to say that there are there are likely to be more headwinds, and with that, maybe more opportunity for some of those that are not as psychologically important as routinized or as strong a momentum for consumers. Here's an example, and these are, you know, this is meant to be kind of a visual to show where there's similarities and differences. So, you know, we typically don't see massive differences between like male, female. But just to look at this, it sort of amplifies the point that if you look at the top 5, and again, the bottom 5 doesn't mean, you know, no women are drinking Rockstar or you know, Dr. Pepper Zero or anything like that. It's just that we cut it very bluntly, you know, at a gender level. You see that, like, for both, Gatorade still performs, so does Frappuccino, so does Lipton, which is sort of an interesting, we were, I guess, a little bit surprised by that. It's interesting that a brand like Nestle Pure Life, a water brand, they're actually creating some uniquely, in the water space, that brand is creating a uniquely strong psychological meaning. It's standing out from the water noise, if you will. And a brand like Dunkin' Iced Coffee, versus, like, if you look for men, Coke and Red Bull pop up. So maybe not a ton of surprises, but, you know, it's sort of a visual representation of how you can slice and dice demographically. This one's a little bit of an eye chart. Remember, as Dwayne said, this report will be available to you, so you don't have to memorize or screenshot all of these. You can reference back. And again, this is just meant to show that across, you know, just again, kind of crude generational breaks, we do see some themes, like for example, Starbucks Frappuccino performing really well, particularly as you go younger. Whereas Gatorade, interestingly, with Gen X and Boomer, it's pretty strong across the board. It's a top 5 for for all those cohorts. Lipton, Lipton's another one that sort of stood out in that way. You'll notice that Gen Z, we find that Gen Z, so younger consumers, 18 to 25 range, everybody's interested in them. They're pretty different. We see this across studies, across categories beyond beverage. There's a lot of brands that are or themes that kind of reside across generations that are different for Gen Z. So like Starbucks, Frap, and Gatorade, yes, very consistent. But there's some other things that we see Gen Z behaviorally being a bit different in terms of their drivers and barriers and the types of brands that are resonating. So again, top 5, bottom 5 at the age cohort, and you can see it. The list changes a bit depending on how you want to cut it and look at it. This is trajectory, looking at increasing versus decreasing. A lot of people are always interested in, what this is representing is of current users, is it decreasing or increasing? And again, this is a leading indicator of kind of how's the brand poised for growth. And look, the category overall, this space overall, everybody knows by and large has been performing really well. I mean, we've all had this insight or this observation of, look, in spite of these pretty dramatic price increases, volumes continue to perform. So this isn't really, we see this similarly in the report we did on snacks. Snacks and beverages are doing really well. So even the lowest, the laggards, if you will, 7-Up, Sprite, and Canada Dry, I mean, their positive trajectory outweighs their negative. So again, not a disparagement, but it says, hey, there's probably some headspace for those brands. There's probably some things they could do that could address this and could accelerate some of that consumption, which obviously many teams are interested in. This is a view that we call our neighborhooding analysis. And so from a neuroscience standpoint, there are basically 4 lenses, 4 gears that someone would shift into and drive their decision making. So there's the rational, which is, basically what this tells us is when consumers do those, I talked about those word clouds, they do these unique exercises, it tells us, what do they think these brands stand for? And so these are the top 3 performers over in the blue wedge here, providing practical options that make rational sense. Often consumers think that's why they make decisions. They think it's rational and practical. And Dasani, Aquafina, and Celsius are there. And that kind of makes sense. I want to talk in a minute that you noticed, and I mentioned this earlier, that Nestle Pure Life is in a different neighborhood. So that's the kind of thing we look for. We go, okay, are all the waters practical and rational? I mean, they're, in Celsius, those are the top 3 that are performing that job. As you move across this kind of radar chart, and in these other neighborhoods, these are the more what they call like system 1, the more emotional, subconscious jobs, decision-making criteria, features of these brands. And so Starry, AHA, and LaCroix are leading the pack on new sensory discoveries to explore. Not terribly surprising for Starry, that it's new, but a little bit interesting that it's being perceived as something, a new discovery, a new experience. And I think a lot, Starry has talked into that. This isn't just another lemon lime. This is something different. And they've so far been successful in kind of rising above the fray in that regard. The tribal neighborhood is one I'm going to talk about that's really strong, especially in CSD. Social connection and agreement, things that are socially and tribally endorsed, everyone can agree on. And you see that interesting, Lipton and then Pepsi and Pure Life are the top 3 here. Something really interesting happening, with Lipton ready to drink. I mentioned that Nestle, I caught my eye that Nestle Pure Life, that a brand would not just be kind of in a neighborhood, but a bottled water brand successfully playing in this. And again, successfully doing it differently than big brands like Dasani and Aquafina. It's in a very different neighborhood. And so when we think about strategy and think about portfolio strategy, you put, the Coca-Cola portfolio on this, what neighborhoods do we have brands in? And where don't we? And what are we competing with? That's what this is meant to do. And again, just showing you the top three. The last neighborhood, the perceptual neighborhood here, is what we call the instinctual, all about fueling feel good, impulse purchase, help me feel better right now. And I think not terribly surprising, you see some energy brands, Mountain Dew over in this space. But I will say a brand like Electrolyte, which is an up and comer, like in the isotonic space, is more in the rational space. And we see this, that for brands like isotonics or energy, sometimes they do sit over in the more rational space. It's a more practical thing than it is just purely kind of feel good. So it can be easy to make assumptions about which neighborhood a category or brand would be in, and that's not always accurate. This is just a recap of those top threes that I just covered. And then the barrier side. I've just got a couple more pages here, and then we'll get to some Q&A. Just like there are these 4 perceptual neighborhoods that drive a brand, there are these perceptual neighborhoods that hold the brand back. So, if we ask consumers, well, how do you make decisions? They often say, oh, it's price, and that's the one over on the left. Will it be a good value for the money? That can influence, and oftentimes that dominates the conversation. There are these other barriers of time. What will I think about doing? Social. What will people think of me? Physical. How bad will this make me feel? Or emotional. Will I be disappointed? Is it overwhelming? And these are, again, the top 3 indexing as being associated with these barriers. So Frappuccino, Starbucks Frap, Dasani, and Smart Water are where consumers at a Gen Pop level are most saying, I kind of think twice about whether this is worth what I'm paying. Time, Alani Nu, Lipton Ghost. It's interesting what we find in this context. We see this a lot when we look at like retailers, like shopping Walmart. Oftentimes there's a time barrier because it's a lot of time. That's easy to get your head around. With brands, you kind of go, well, what is a time cost for Alani Nu or Lipton? And a lot of times when you see some of these brands, it can be having to find it, having to get it. It takes a little more of an effortful, seeking out, going to, just from a distribution standpoint, finding things. Social, what will other people think of me? Physical, how bad will this make me feel? You see, Note Bang is in this space, and then the emotional. Will I be disappointed? Is this going to perform? Is it going to do what I want it to do? When you find that your brand is over in sort of anywhere other than the price, it gives so many avenues out of a dealing, promotion, price value conversation. It gives so many more, if you imagine sweeten the carrot, shorten the stick. These are other sticks that consumers perceive that need to be shortened that have nothing to do with price. And it can be really instructive and valuable in maintaining margin, but creating advantage. Okay, so I mentioned Dr. Pepper. I'm going to finish here with an example of like, what would you do with this? And this is a high level example, and I'm not trying to pick on Dr. Pepper. We picked it because pick on it or celebrate it. We picked it because it's set in the middle, set at number 25. And so recalling the attribution of Dr. Pepper, it's got decreasing momentum. Again, not to say that the brand is circling the drain. It's just we see some headwinds in terms of that consumption trajectory at a Gen Pop level. However, very strongly routinized, in the 71st percentile it's a part of my life. You think back to the old, like, I'm a pepper, like it's a thing that I do. If I do it, I do it. However, there's relatively low psych attachment. It would be relatively easy to give up. In other words, I, the consumer, I'm open. I'm open to a better offer. So we look at those diagnostics, and then we look at, I mentioned the neighborhooding. Dr. Pepper's in a crowded neighborhood, this tribal neighborhood. And so you see the top 3, recall, were Nestle, Pure Life, Pepsi, and Lipton. Over on the right are the indexes of some other really high performing and notable brands, or high indexing and notable brands that are also in this neighborhood. So you saw Lipton, Pepsi, Pure Life, Coke, just behind, Sprite, and then Dr. Pepper. And you see these indexes. And so what it says is Dr. Pepper is in this social connection space. It's just not doing it as strongly as all these others. And so when we look at this, and there's some secondary data that I'm gonna hold back for now. It gets a little more intricate, but when we look at like, okay, well, why? Dr. Pepper's in this social connection. What could it do? What could the brand do to better, if it wanted to provide this social connection job, drive some of that, in this case, emotional attachment and momentum? How could it do it? And so again, looking at the nature of this neighborhood and some of the corroborating data, what you see is that the brand right now on the left is doing, or at least this is pulled from some May promotion, some Instagram promotion of Perk Up at summertime. So this Pepper Perks appears to be, and I have no knowledge of this or this is purely observed from pulling off the internet. Perk Up at summertime. So this Pepper Perk seems to be a big piece of the promotional program over the summer. What this would say is that in order to better compete in this neighborhood, to move this 112 up to a higher index, meaning to better provide social connection, the opportunity for Dr. Pepper is actually to celebrate the individual, to give you as the consumer a way to show your uniqueness among the social group. So in order to provide social connection agreement, there's this signal that we see that Dr. Pepper could provide a way to show your uniqueness within the social tribe. And so just an example, take the creative as it's intended, from something like Perk Up at summertime, which is kind of a, hey, get free stuff, using something like the Pepper Perks format, still giving away swag, but pivoting it to say, look, show your summer flavor. Now the perks aren't just things I can get for free. There are ways I can show that I'm unique. There are ways I can provide something additive and unique within this social mindset that the brand is playing. Those little tweaks, again, it's an Instagram headline here, but a strategic tweak like that, we've seen have dramatic results in performance. It can have dramatic results in driving some of those psychological factors that I mentioned that then translate directly to behavior. So that gives you a bit of a use case, bit of an example. But essentially what we're doing with this data set is what we call syndicated plus plus. We have this data set in our broader database that we use to create behavioral profiling, how you can win, who do you have to win with? And I've caveated many times, we're looking at Gen Pop. What we do is go in and say, look, who's a brand getting? Who's a portfolio getting now? Who aren't they? Why? And then who do you have to beat? Who are your competitive neighbors? If you're Nestle Pure Life, are you really competing with Dasani and Aquafina? I mean, literally. But interestingly, you're in a neighborhood with CSDs and other things. What are the strategic implications for that? That competitive neighboring can be really useful. And then, as I mentioned at the top of this, okay, how do I win? Who do I have to beat? How do I beat them? And that's where this idea of heuristics comes in, which is a fancy way of saying decision-making criteria. So looking at what's your omni-channel strategy, what's your social media strategy? I mentioned the Dr. Pepper example, and then design and packaging. How do you show up? This is very instructive, and we can use these data, and that's kind of the plus part to provide the playbook, the guidance to address to leverage the tailwinds and to address the headwinds that we see, some of which I mentioned here. And I'm sure my team would be happy to hear from you if you want to use that email address there. Okay, Dwayne, I think that covered. Hopefully I didn't race through that. We covered everything, and happy to circle back and answer questions and have some discussion.
Yeah, no, that's great, Hunter. And we can move back to any slides if someone wants to, et cetera. We do have a little bit of, we have some questions coming in now. A reminder to the audience, please use the Q&A function to ask us questions, and we'll spend a little bit of time here helping you delve into this. First of all, I think we have a couple of questions related to methodology. Why don't we go ahead and talk about those real quick? One wants to know, about the total sample size and whether the questions were geared to the entire sample related to these brands or to people who actually use the brands. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also the sample size, because it's a robust sample size?
Yeah. So, what we say is we're measuring these deep psychological factors at a statistical quantitative level. So it's in this case, a 3,000 person Gen Pop sample. And so it's representative of the U.S. Population. To the point on brands, we don't want somebody attributing psychology to a brand that they have no awareness or interaction with. So the way that the study works is somebody has to have at least rare, they have to have at least rarely consume. And we don't ask like, when was the last time you consumed? There's this pretty widely established truth in the research space that people are terrible at attributing what they did or when they did it. So the way we get at that is say, look, do you use this? And they have to use it, and that there's some psychology behind that. They have to use it rarely or more to then be served the diagnostic on the brand itself. So what we're getting at the brands, some of the things are gen pop everybody. Some of the things at the brand level, like which neighborhood it's in, are for people that use it sometimes at least have some experience with it.
And when it comes to margin of error on something like this, it depends on the sample sizes, the number of people that use each of the brands. I assume that that varies based on that. But how confident are you in the individual brands that are depicted here in terms of what you learn from consumers?
Yeah, what I will say is that everything that we've shared here is statistically significant, typically highly statistically significant. I would defer to my data team, to Siggy and his team on that. But because in the way the sampling and the algorithms, the back end works, all of it's run and analyzed by our team of neuroscientists. Everything that we generate, and particularly anything that we share, is statistically significant.
And clearly, we didn't start out here with every brand in the world and quiz participants on that. These brands that in essence, we took 50 brands to start that were large, important, influential, category defining brands. And that's why some brands, for instance, a Topo Chico or an Olipop or a Vita Coco might not show up here, but this sort of methodology can be applied to any brand. Is that right? Can you talk about that?
It is, and that's exactly what we do. So if someone came and said, well, what about Vita Coco or Olipop? We'd say, okay, well, let us just go out and run the same measure on them, and then they're in there. So that's the database value of it. And that's where we can go back and say, like over time, we've been looking at like CSV, for example, in our database for many years, and we can say, well, what's the trajectory been of that? So yeah, it can be applied to any brand, whether it's a big brand that everybody knows about, or we've done studies actually in beverage in other countries, in that case, for categories that didn't exist there. So that's where we're able to get psychology on things, even if it's not really salient in someone's mind.
And we collaborated on this list, and a lot of it was driven by the largest brands, for instance, as we measure in our fact book from a volume perspective and a value perspective, but also brands in certain categories that might be smaller, but that category is an influential or important growing category. And so we've included some representative brands from that as well.
Yep. And that to your point on the list selection, we look at the eight categories. We wanted to make sure we had several brands in each of those categories, such that we could, provide some relativity. Is this brand doing well, or is the category, those brands we have representing the category, how's that perform?
So we have another question. One of our participants asked for two players in the same category with different attachment scores. For example, Gatorade being at 100, but Powerade at 57. Do you understand why? Do you understand why one is so much harder to give up versus the other?
Yeah, I mean, what that says is that what the short answer is, it's based on what neighborhood they're in. Where perceptually someone puts them. So if the role of Gatorade, and I'm trying to walk and chew gum here, if the role of isotonics in Gatorade is to provide instinctual feel-good impulse purchase, and Gatorade's directly aligned with that, that typically will create a lot more psychological, salience. Where, and so if Powerade were over in the rational practical, we might say, well, that's the unlock. That's why it's not doing the right job. It's not fulfilling the right criteria that that its competitor is. And that's where then we can get into the diagnostics. I have this page up that doesn't have either Gatorade or Powerade. And interestingly, what this says is, look, Gatorade, even though it's number one and Powerade's, top 10, they're not top three in any of these exact neighborhoods. So just to recap what I just said, the way you get at why is one creating some heart better than another, it's because it's better aligning with one of these four really emotional jobs that they're looking to the category to do.
A bit of a follow-up to that, if a brand is high on this list, but that's not translating into a large business size of business, like Chameleon cold brew coffee, for instance, being ranked higher than Dr. Pepper, what factors are inhibiting growth in that situation?
Yeah, and that some of that is where you have to complement this with conventional things like ACV, distribution data, things like that. And so what we find in instances like that, and I made that caveat. Remember, this isn't a sales ranking, because otherwise we'd all know what it was. You run the IRI and everybody would know what it is. That's where that becomes really interesting. That a brand like Chameleon has more psychological voltage than a brand like Dr. Pepper. What it means is, among those people, I'm trying to find where it is on here as I go. What it means is, of those using it, probably what's driving Chameleon is it's that usage momentum. Pretty low routinization, the 6th percentile, but relative to that, pretty good, 25th percentile in heart. So what it says is, of the fewer, and compared to Dr. Pepper, dramatically fewer consumers who are consuming Chameleon, they really are starting to, they're really starting to become attached to it. It hasn't yet become part of their routine, but it's growing. And so that's what in this case would drive its ranking higher than a brand like DP, which is much more routinized, kind of similar in terms of their emotional attachment to it, but decreasing. That's where a smaller brand can psychologically outperform a bigger brand. And that's where, when you get into those diagnostics, why. And I don't think Chameleon and Dr. Pepper are trading volume very much, but that's how this ranking can be unexpected in that way.
So you mentioned routinization again. So when it comes to measuring routinization, let's say someone only drinks one soda, they drink a soda once a week, but it's the same brand. Is that what you're talking about when it comes to routine, or is that out of everything a person drinks weekly or monthly? One of our users wants to know that.
Yeah. So what we look at is not so much how many does it get. You see a lot of categories where a heavy user will be 2 times annually. And it's like, we're not concerned as much with things like that. Like, how much is it? What we're measuring is how much in their mind, in their heart of hearts, is it a part of their routine? And essentially, the lay terms way of describing it is, you say, Dwayne, do you drink Dr. Pepper? Like, do you drink it? I'm not asking, have you had one? I'm not asking, do you drink it at football games? I'm saying, do you drink Dr. Pepper? That workup of, do they basically self-identify as this being something they consume? That's the unlock of it. Then you corroborate it with again, those other kind of known data. Yeah, well, how much literally is being sold? What are the velocities? That's where then you can establish the headspace. And what we find, what's really interesting, is there's been a lot of cases where somebody that consumes something, let's say somebody eats 5 chicken sandwiches a month. You go, wow, they're a heavy user. And you say, do you eat chicken sandwiches? And I'm paraphrasing the methodology here, but in the gist is, we're saying, do you eat chicken sandwiches? They say yes. We go, do you eat a lot of them? Not really. I eat about the same amount as other people. That's where you start to go, okay, so somebody we thought was a heavy user, which for chicken sandwiches is 5 times a month. Yes, they use them, but they've got a lot of headspace. That audience is open to consuming more chicken sandwiches. So that's where you can inadvertently assume that 2 Dr. Peppers a week is a lot of Dr. Peppers. We're going, hey, of the people for whom it's routinized, and yes, it's I do it. We use other data, the organizations use other data to say, well, that's our 2 times a week people. They've actually got headspace. That's a growth opportunity for us. Or no, they're pretty saturated. They think they drink more Dr. Pepper than most people. We're not going to sell them any. That's where then, when you get into the application of this, using the other data sets, traditional data sets, and more like, scanner, numerator, IRI type data, that's where you can really complete the picture.
Yeah, very interesting. We've got another question. When it comes to that Gen Pop screen, you might want to pop that up real quick from earlier in the presentation. Someone asks, do you do similar analyses that is values based versus that generation based, which you showed earlier? So values based analysis. So how consumers value various things and what their core value set is, I suppose, is what this questioner is asking, versus just how they come to it from an age perspective.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, there was a values workup that we had a while back, and it was more of a cultural, like kind of an anthropology based values workup. What we found is it wasn't indicative of behavior. So these drivers and barriers, those neighborhoods, those are really at the core of somebody's quote values. But what's important to note when you get in subjects like values, like, this happens a lot with like ESG and purpose and thinking about, well, what should our brand mean? The trouble that brands can get into is not looking at context. So if I said, Dwayne, what are your values? What do you value? You said, I value family, and whatever you'd answer. That the role of CSD or bottled coffee can be dramatically different. And that's not to say that you wouldn't necessarily buy a brand that aligns with your values, but it's also not to say that that's the only reason you would. So if looking at somebody's values can be a bit of a can misdirect, can pull a brand off strategy. What we're looking for is, in the context of beverage, what role is it playing? Is it playing like a little vacation? I want to go discover something new. That was the neighborhood Starry was in. Or is it something that's, very tribal? Yes, it aligns with my values. It aligns with what I believe and is socially agreed upon. Those two can be dramatically different. And the same person can hire a brand, can buy Starry for a very different role than their overall values. So I may be misconstruing the question, but essentially, these are the foundational psychological decision-making criteria in the context of the category that we're studying. And the reason you buy a soft drink, even within beverage, the reason you buy a soft drink, drink it, can be very different than the reason you buy an isotonic 2 hours later and drink it.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That answers the question, I believe. So what about private label brands? Do you have the ability to apply this to private label? Are there any differences that make that more challenging or not? How might we think about that? Because obviously, especially now as pricing is moving up, there's a lot of interest in how private label will perform against brands. What can you say about that for this user who's asking this question?
Yeah, we absolutely can. And in my view, private labels are brands. So I mentioned we did a version of this that people may have seen called the Snack 50 that was about snacks. And we did include about 9 what I'd call owned brands. Kirkland, Kroger Private Selection, Walmart Great Value, brands like that. The reason we included those there is snacks, they're seeing a lot more volume interchange. Beverages, we typically see less. And Dwayne, I kind of defer to you on that. So we didn't include it. It's absolutely something you can attribute. And in fact, in snacks, what we found is the people that are buying, I'll be very general here, the people that are buying private label aren't buying it because it's cheaper. They were buying it because there was a much more social, tribal, we've all discovered that this is a better option, and we've rallied around it. So the reason behind private label in the snack space we found was very different from what many assume. It is easy to attribute. It just hasn't been something that, like, from the C-suites of various beverage companies, we just haven't heard as much concern. So we didn't include it in this report.
Was there anything just on the snack side? Was there anything that really jumped out at you about the owned brands there versus brands that either surprised you or is meaningful?
Yeah, just that point that it was much more tribal, much more social and tribal. And it was interesting because their driver was social agreement and their barrier was, what will other people think? So, what I was counseling is, if I work for Frito-Lay, this is not is it cheaper? There is a very different avenue, and it's a very socially driven avenue that you could pursue if you're in fact seeing issues with private label. So, you'd say, look, this is something that everybody can agree upon, and it's going to be a great experience if you provide Frito-Lay products versus, a private label competitor, because the people that are vulnerable to switching, that's the criteria in their mind, not just the dollars used. So that was a pretty big aha. And we often find, for example, we'll find that like the barrier with private label is emotional. Will I be disappointed? So if you were a beverage brand in a given category, you'd want to really amplify, a lot of brands are tempted to race to the bottom, line price to private label, assuming that that's why. We've got a couple case studies in our history where that wasn't why. A brand line price and they still bought the private label because there was a different reason that they were doing it. It was a much more emotional reason. So for today's purposes, my counsel would be, if you're in a private label issue, the first step is step back and don't assume it's just because of the price. There's emotional factors at play. And, if you use this report, think about the social and the emotional mainly. What will people think of me and will I be disappointed? Leverage that to combat private label before you start taking pricing. That's the macro insight that we've seen across our data.
So another issue that's really important right now in beverages has to do with how consumers think about sugar, sugar consumption, calorie consumption. Big initiative now to move consumers to low and no calorie beverages.
Yeah.
One of the attendees wants to know, what do you predict will move consumers to choose zero sugar or lower sugar drinks? Is there anything you can glean based on this research about that question?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, if you think about traditional market research, most of it, what people think they think, so if you ask somebody, how do you make decisions? We think we're rational creatures. We humans, our conscious brains say, well, we compare and use rational considerations. That's true in some cases. And for Dasani and Aquafina and Celsius, that appears to be what's driving those brands. However, there are all these other cases. And so what we see is, and again, I'm totally generalizing on zeros, what the editorial commentary is, the zeros have focused too much on the zero. They focus too much on the rational, hey, it's got no sugar. A brand could stand out by saying, look, consumers are going to figure out that it's got no sugar. You don't have to harp on the rational benefits. What you need to push into is a more experiential discovery. I think Coke did this effectively a few years ago with Coke Zero, where it was, could it be the best Coke ever? That was a really brilliant campaign because it asked a question. It didn't say, none of the calories are very rational things. It put it in the consumer's mind, and that put it in this very experiential place. You could say a zero should say, compare it with your friends, who likes it, better than regular. That would be a more tribal approach than the instinctual, like the quickest feel good, you'll have all day. Something that's very much about the experience, and let the zero sugar thing be kind of, sit on its face. Don't highlight that. Take those off the cuff examples for what they're worth. But what we find is none of the zeros, or, generalizing, are meaning a whole lot. They're not popping up in any of these neighborhoods. They haven't established a really strong psychological, like beachhead in consumers' hearts and minds. The brands need to explore these other neighborhoods, these other avenues of making it mean something beyond just better for you, because better for you may be a play, but if that's the play that all the zeros are doing, it's not creating any voltage.
That's interesting.
Or it's not creating as much as it could, I should say.
Yeah. So the zero sugar component is almost the baseline, but there's other factors built on top of that that's really driving the purchase decision.
Yeah. Well, and you look at things like Celsius, which has been, I know we were talking about this last December, and it's, it sort of was a sort of like a shooting star that emerged. There's a lot in the low, no calorie kind of space. There's a lot more perceptual competition. And so, that's another sort of indicator that a zero CSD type brand needs to mean something more than just a not sugar version of itself. And again, armchair quarterbacking a bit, looking at these other avenues, those are the ways forward out of it. And we don't see any necessarily doing that, unlike what Nestle Pure Life has achieved. They're like a top player in the tribal neighborhood, and it's a water brand. I look at things like that and say, yeah, a zero brand could really stand out, but they're going to have to move beyond the better for you space, because that doesn't appear to be creating a lot of emotional juice.
Yeah, on its face, a brand like Nestle Pure Life could be a little surprising because the category, the bottled water category, is so heavily commoditized
Yeah.
that you wonder, how they end up ranking so high. But that tribal element is really key here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They've created something to it in the Pure Life. And I mean, you don't want to read too much into the logo type here, but they've talked about Pure Life. I mean, the brand itself, and they've got the little people, that they've successfully done something that makes this a more socially relevant and brand. And that's something unique to like what Dasani and Aquafina. And it's not to say that one's right and one's wrong. It's always interesting to me, though, when something seemingly pretty perfunctory, like you said, like bottled water, resides strongly in a neighborhood different than its literal peers. It's zigging where the market zags. You'd have to talk to Nestle and Coke and Pepsi to talk about those brand performances and say, well, is that a good thing, or is Nestle in trouble because of that? That's again where you've got to contextualize this psychological insight with the market performance. But that's where then you can go, aha, that's why Nestle's really thriving, or that's why it's really struggling. And here are the implications to move it, to move neighborhoods, or to better, like I said, Dr. Pepper, better compete in my existing neighborhood, et cetera.
Another question about the generations depicted here. One of the attendees wants to know why millennials and boomers were the only age groups broken down into young or older.
Oh, interesting. So this is a bit of a soapbox for me. This construct of generations, we're sort of breaking our own rule here. These are constructs. So Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, Boomer, we're made up by marketers. We rarely see in our data that they're reflective. Oftentimes, Boomers and young Millennials actually share a lot of similar psychology. So when we do our data cuts, we typically don't use the conventional definitions. In this case, in younger millennials and older millennials, we see so much difference between them. We broke them out. So we always break out younger and older. When we do a typical study, we'll say, look, we're not going to assume that they break by age anywhere. We did it here because it's a construct teams are familiar with and kind of take and use to a degree. But you will certainly see breakouts for a given context. Young millennials and boomers actually mentally might look exactly the same. So younger millennials and older millennials have been so emphatically different in our data that we pulled them apart here. Otherwise, we use the conventional constructs.
I like to say that I know boomers who are just as millennial as any millennial in terms of some of their social media and other habits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's, you may find that boomers are using Gatorade and it's in one perceptual neighborhood for them. They might be using it for very rational, practical reasons. And Gen Z is using Gatorade for a much more, I want to feel good right now. So their reasons might be different. But anyway, that's a bit of commentary on why we broke these out. We kind of broke our own rule and kind of didn't by doing at least the millennial break.
No, that's a good explanation though. So one of our attendees wants to know is, for Gatorade, for instance, being in the #1 position in this top 50, is that not a function of the fact that the brand appeals widely? They weren't in the top of all the neighborhoods, for instance.
Yeah, so typically when a brand is really widely accepted, it's more in that social tribal neighborhood. You see that here. I mean, we see that pretty often. I mean, look, these are like the big dogs. It's like nobody got fired for bringing Sprite to a party. Like they're socially endorsed. What it tells us with Gatorade, and I don't have, we've provided some kind of aggregate level, like the tops and the bottoms. It's interesting to me when a brand like Gatorade is not necessarily in the top 3 of a given neighborhood. But I mean, look at Coke. It's like a 121. Coke is a hugely super high penetration brand. Just because it's not the top indexing on the tribal neighborhood doesn't mean it's not successfully doing that job. What can happen is the bigger the brand and the more people are using it. I suspect this is the case with Gatorade. Like I said, a boomer might be using it for one reason, a Gen Z might be using it for another reason, and that can wash out the data a little bit. It's like, hey, for this cohort, it's this neighborhood, for this cohort, it's this neighborhood. So when you combine that at Gen Pop, it doesn't pop in any neighborhood. That can sometimes happen in the data. And as I said, that's where it's important to look at this and go, hey, if someone calls and says, hey, we're starting to struggle a little bit with younger consumers. We're seeing our buy rate drop. We don't know why. That's where they go, oh, it's because they think it's in a totally different neighborhood than everybody else. That's where then the diagnostics can become really valuable.
I think that's about all the time we have. Any parting shot before we leave?
I enjoyed it. Always, I know, Dwayne, we're going to continue to share this stuff out, and happy to answer follow-up questions. So thanks for the discussion. It was great.
And again, the presentation will be available. There will be a recording that will share a link with our attendees today. Thank you for all the great questions, made for a really fantastic conversation. And thank you, Alpha Diver. It's been a pleasure working with you on this, and looking forward to hearing a lot more.
Likewise. Have a good rest of the day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.